Vexidar adjusted his iridescent robes, and gazed out at the desolate landscape of Keth 9 with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from dumping your problems on someone else's doorstep. Well, technically this wasn't anyone's doorstep since the planet was about as inhabited as a tax collector's conscience, but the principle remained the same. Perfect, he muttered, his forearms gesturing dramatically at the endless expanse of red sand and crystalline rock formations. Absolutely perfect for disposing of defective merchandise. The little creatures whimpered softly, their scales dulled from dehydration and fear. Their eyes, normally bright gold according to the species documentation, had faded to a tired amber. Vexidar's species, the Zephyrians, prided themselves on being the galaxy's premier exotic animal dealers. They had a reputation to maintain, after all. Can't have substandard products tarnishing their stellar business model of selling sentient beings to the highest bidder. The free market at its finest, really. Now my disappointing little lizards, Vexidar said, using his anti-grav platform to float the cubs out of his ship. This is where we part ways. You see, when I purchased you from that delightful flesh market on Grimm Station, I was assured you were premium breeding stock. Fire breathers, rare, valuable. He dumped them unceremoniously onto the scorching sand, where they landed with small thuds that would have been heartbreaking if Vexidar had possessed anything resembling a heart. Instead, what do I get? Two runts who can barely produce a spark between them. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was when Lord Crixus tried to demonstrate your capabilities to his dinner guests? The man paid 3 million credits for a proper fire show, and you gave him what can only be described as a cosmic sneeze. The cubs huddled together, their tiny claws scraping against the restraints. The smaller one, with scales that shifted between copper and gold, made a sound that was part whimper, part growl. Its companion, slightly larger with scales like polished obsidian, pressed close for comfort. Oh, don't give me those pathetic looks, Vexidar continued, clearly enjoying his villain monologue. Business is business, I have a reputation to maintain. Vexidar's exotic emporium doesn't deal in factory seconds. The twin sons of Keth 9 beat down mercilessly, already beginning to crack the sand around the cubs. The planet's surface temperature during the day reached levels that could cook most organic matter within hours. At night, it dropped to temperatures that could freeze nitrogen. It was, by all accounts, the perfect place to dispose of unwanted inventory, without getting your hands dirty. Now, I could have simply spaced you, Vexidar said thoughtfully, examining his perfectly manicured claws. But that would have been wasteful. This way, nature takes its course, and I can honestly tell my insurance company that you died of natural causes. Heat stroke is perfectly natural on a desert planet. He paused, tilting his elongated head as if struck by a sudden thought. Plus your remains might attract some interesting scavengers. I hear Keth 9 has some fascinating predatory species. Your bones could end up in some collector's display case. See, even in death you're contributing to the exotic trade. I'm practically doing you a favor. The cubs' energy restraints were designed to last exactly 24 standard hours before their power cells died. Just long enough to prevent them from escaping before the planet's harsh environment finished the job, but not so long that they'd suffer unnecessarily. Vexidar wasn't cruel, after all. He was simply practical. Well, this has been delightfully cathartic, he announced, floating back toward his sleek vessel. Do try not to take this personally. It's just business. As his ship's engines hummed to life, Vexidar allowed himself a moment of smug satisfaction. Problem solved, reputation intact, and he'd even managed to claim the cubs as a business loss on his taxes. The galaxy's bureaucrats would never know the difference. His ship lifted off in a cloud of superheated sand, leaving behind two small forms bound on the desert floor. The cubs watched the silver dot disappear into the amber sky, their golden eyes reflecting nothing but confusion and growing despair. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind across ancient dunes and the distant call of something that might have been a scavenger bird. Or might have been something much worse. 6 hours later, the Lucky Strike limped into Keth 9's atmosphere with all the grace of a drunk elephant attempting ballet. The ship's hull, a patchwork of salvaged plates and optimistic welding, groaned under the stress of atmospheric entry. Inside the cockpit, Jake Murphy fought with controls that had seen better decades. "Come on, you beautiful piece of junk," Jake muttered, coaxing the landing thrusters to life. "Just one more soft landing. I promise I'll get you proper parts this time instead of whatever I can steal from the scrapyard." The Lucky Strike responded by making a sound that suggested its feelings were hurt, then managed a landing that only dented the hull in 3 new places. Jake considered this a victory. Right, he said, pulling on his environmental suit. According to the sensor readings, there should be a crashed Meridian freighter about 2 clicks northeast. That's premium salvage, baby. Those ships have quantum processors that'll pay for new coffee for at least a month. Jake Murphy was what the polite galaxy called a salvage operator, and what everyone else called a vulture. He specialized in finding valuable junk on planets that most beings wouldn't visit on a dare. Keth 9 was perfect for his line of work, mostly because anyone dumb enough to crash here was usually too dead to complain about him taking their stuff. He'd been at this for 12 years, ever since leaving Earth's colonial marines with what his discharge papers diplomatically called authority issues. Turned out telling your commanding officer that his tactical brilliance was roughly equivalent to a concussed hamster's wasn't considered constructive feedback. Let's see what kind of Christmas presents the universe left me today, Jake said, activating his suit's cooling system as he stepped into the blazing heat. The trek across the desert was routine until Jake's metal detector started going haywire near a cluster of crystalline formations. Instead of the steady beep that indicated buried metal, it was producing a frantic electronic seizure. What the hell is wrong with you now? Jake asked the device, giving it the percussive maintenance that had kept it running for years. Are you picking up interference from the crystals, or did you finally have that nervous breakdown I've been predicting? That's when he heard it. A soft whimpering sound, barely audible over the wind. Jake froze, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma pistol on his hip. On planets like Keth 9, unexpected sounds usually meant something was about to try eating you. Okay, Murphy, he said to himself, a habit he'd developed after years of working alone. Either that's a very small predator, or you're finally losing it from too much recycled air and instant coffee. He followed the sound around a large crystal formation, and stopped dead in his tracks. 2 small creatures, no bigger than house cats, were tied up with some kind of energy restraints. They looked like tiny dragons, if dragons came in copper, gold, and obsidian color schemes. Well, I'll be damned, Jake said, lowering his weapon. What are you two supposed to be? The cubs looked up at him with those big golden eyes that seemed to say, please don't be another psychopath with a business plan. Jake's first instinct was to keep walking. He was a salvage operator, not a veterinarian. He dealt with broken machines, not broken animals. Besides, these things were probably dangerous. They looked like dragons, and dragons were the kind of creatures that tended to solve their problems with fire and teeth. But as he started to turn away, the smaller cub made a sound that hit him right in whatever was left of his conscience. It was the kind of sound that said, I know you're probably going to leave me here to die, but I thought I'd ask nicely anyway. Damn it, Jake muttered. I don't have time for this. I've got salvage to find, bills to pay, and a ship that's held together with prayer and spite. The cubs just looked at him, not understanding his words but clearly recognizing the universal tone of someone talking themselves out of doing the right thing. Jake stood there for a full minute, having an argument with himself that he was destined to lose. He'd always been a sucker for underdogs, which was probably why he'd ended up as a small-time salvage operator instead of the successful mercenary his military training had prepared him for. This is stupid, he announced to the desert. They're probably someone's pets, or livestock, or they'll grow up to be the size of shuttlecraft and eat me in my sleep. The larger cub tilted its head, as if trying to understand why this strange bipedal creature was having a conversation with the air. Fine, Jake said, pulling out his multi-tool. But if you two turn out to be some kind of exotic space plague, I'm putting it on my taxes as a business expense. As he approached the cubs, they shrank back in fear. Jake couldn't blame them. His environmental suit made him look like a particularly ugly robot, and given their current situation, they probably weren't feeling trusting toward alien species in general. Easy there, little dragons, Jake said, trying to make his voice sound less threatening. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just really bad at this whole rescue thing, so bear with me. The energy restraints were clearly alien technology, but Jake had spent enough time salvaging alien wrecks to recognize the general principle. He found what looked like a power coupling and carefully disconnected it. The purple glow faded, and the restraints fell away. The cubs immediately scrambled away from him, huddling together behind a rock formation. They were clearly terrified, but also too weak to run very far. Right, Jake said, looking at his new problem. So now I've got 2 baby dragons, no idea what they eat, and about 6 hours of daylight left to figure out what to do with you. He looked back toward his ship, then at the cubs, then at the desert stretching endlessly in all directions. This is definitely not in my job description. Back aboard the Lucky Strike, Jake stared at his new passengers with the expression of a man who'd just volunteered to babysit a pair of hand grenades. The cubs huddled in the corner of his cargo bay, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and the kind of wariness that comes from recent abandonment trauma. Okay, Jake said, consulting his tablet. Let's see what the Galactic database has to say about dragon care. Step 1. Provide adequate nutrition. Step 2. Maintain proper environmental conditions. Step 3. Consult a qualified xenobiologist. He looked around his ship, which contained exactly 0 qualified xenobiologists, and a food supply that consisted mainly of military rations and instant coffee. Right. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The smaller cub, the one with the copper-gold scales, crept forward slightly. It made a soft chirping sound that might have been curiosity, or might have been a request for food. Hard to tell with species you'd never encountered before. You hungry, little guy? Jake asked, rummaging through his supplies. Let's see what we've got. Protein bars, reconstituted beef stew, more protein bars, and something that claims to be chicken, but I have my doubts. He offered a piece of protein bar to the cub, who sniffed it cautiously, then took a small bite. The expression that crossed its tiny face was remarkably similar to what Jake felt every time he ate his own cooking. Yeah, I know, Jake said sympathetically. But it's got nutrients and stuff. Probably. The larger cub, the obsidian-scaled one, remained more cautious. It watched its companion eat, then slowly approached when it became clear that the protein bar wasn't poisonous. Jake noticed that it positioned itself between him and the smaller cub, clearly taking on a protective role. You're the big brother, huh? Jake said. I get it. Someone's got to keep an eye on things. Over the next few hours, Jake discovered several important facts about dragon cubs. First, they were incredibly intelligent. When he showed them how the water dispenser worked, they figured out the mechanism immediately. Second, they had distinct personalities. The smaller one was bold and curious, constantly exploring the ship and getting into things. The larger one was more cautious but fiercely protective of his companion. You know what? Jake said, watching the smaller cub investigate his toolbox with scientific thoroughness. You need names. Can't keep calling you hey you and the other one. The curious cub looked up at him and made a sound that was almost like a question. How about Spark? Jake suggested. You've got that whole energetic thing going on, plus your scales kind of shimmer like sparks when you move. Spark chirped approvingly, or at least Jake chose to interpret it as approval. And you, he said to the larger cub. You're definitely an Ember. Steady, reliable, but I bet you've got fire in you when it counts. Ember regarded him solemnly, then gave what might have been a nod. Great, now we're getting somewhere. Next problem, where exactly are you two supposed to sleep? Because my bunk is barely big enough for me, and the cargo bay gets cold at night. The solution, as it turned out, was to raid his emergency supply kit for thermal blankets and create a makeshift nest near the ship's heating vent. The cubs settled into it immediately, curling up together in a way that was adorable enough to make Jake's teeth hurt. Don't get used to this, he told them firmly. This is temporary. As soon as I figure out where you came from, we're getting you back to your family. Spark poked his head up, and made a sound that Jake was starting to recognize as disagreement. What do you mean no? You've got to have a family somewhere. Dragons don't just spontaneously generate in the desert. But even as he said it, Jake was remembering the energy restraints, the remote location, the fact that the cubs had been left to die. Someone had dumped them there deliberately. Son of a... Jake caught himself before finishing the curse. Somehow, swearing in front of baby dragons felt wrong. Someone abandoned you, didn't they? The cub's reaction told him everything he needed to know. Ember made a low, mournful sound, while Spark pressed closer to his larger companion. Well, that's just great, Jake muttered. Some piece of garbage alien thinks they can just throw away a couple of kids because they're inconvenient. What kind of sick? He stopped himself again, taking a deep breath. You know what? Their loss. You two are obviously way too good for whatever loser couldn't appreciate you. Over the following days, as Jake continued his salvage work with 2 small dragons in tow, an interesting dynamic developed. The cubs began following him around the ship, learning his routines, even trying to help with simple tasks. Spark had figured out how to operate the cargo bay doors and seemed to take pride in opening them for Jake when he returned from salvage runs. Ember had appointed himself chief inspector of anything Jake brought aboard, carefully examining each piece of salvage as if checking for quality. You know, Jake said one evening, watching Ember organize his tool collection by size while Spark practiced what looked like breathing exercises. You two are better crew than most of the humans I've worked with. You don't complain about the food, you don't leave messes everywhere, and you haven't tried to mutiny once. Spark looked up from his breathing practice and produced a small puff of smoke. Not fire, exactly, but definitely warmer than ambient air. Well, look at that, Jake said, impressed. You are a fire breather. Just needed someone to believe in you, huh? The pride in Spark's golden eyes was unmistakable. Ember left the tools and came over to nuzzle his smaller companion, clearly sharing in the achievement. Jake found himself grinning like an idiot. Yeah, that's my boys. I knew you had it in you. The moment the words left his mouth, Jake realized what he'd said. My boys. When had that happened? When had 2 abandoned dragon cubs become his responsibility, his crew, his family? Oh no, he said to himself. I've gotten attached. This is bad. I don't do attachments. Attachments are for people with stable jobs and permanent addresses. But looking at Spark practicing his smoke rings, while Ember watched protectively, Jake couldn't bring himself to regret it. Maybe having a family wasn't such a terrible thing after all. Of course, that's when his proximity alarm started screaming, indicating an incoming ship. Company, Jake announced grimly, recognizing the sleek profile on his scanner. And something tells me they're not here for a social visit. The ship that settled onto Keth 9's surface with elegant precision was everything the Lucky Strike wasn't. Sleek where Jake's ship was patched, gleaming where his was scarred, and probably worth more than Jake would make in several lifetimes of salvage work. It screamed expensive alien with more money than sense. Jake watched through his viewport as a familiar 4-armed figure emerged, followed by what looked like a small army of hired muscle. The kind of beings who charged by the hour and measured success by the number of people who ended up requiring medical attention. Well, Jake muttered, checking his weapons. Looks like someone came back to clean up loose ends. Spark and Ember pressed against his legs, sensing the tension. They might not understand the situation completely, but they recognized danger when they saw it. Stay close to me, boys, Jake said, his voice taking on the hard edge that had gotten him through too many combat zones. And whatever happens, remember what I taught you about hiding in the cargo compartments. The ship's comm system crackled to life with a transmission that oozed condescension from every syllable. Greetings, primitive salvage vessel, came Vexstar's pompous voice. I am Vexstar of the Exotic Emporium, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jake keyed his comm with perhaps more force than necessary. Sorry, pal, but everything on this ship was legally salvaged from unclaimed territory. Got the paperwork and everything. I think you misunderstand, Vexstar replied, his tone suggesting he was talking to someone particularly slow. I'm referring to 2 defective dragon specimens that I discarded in this location several days ago. My sensors indicate they are currently aboard your vessel. Defective. Jake's voice went dangerously quiet. You mean Spark and Ember? Yeah, they're here. Funny thing about that though, they don't seem defective to me. They seem like a couple of kids who got dumped by some piece of garbage who didn't deserve them. There was a pause, then Vexstar's laughter came through the comm. It was the kind of laugh that made you want to punch something expensive. Oh, how delightfully naive, Vexstar said. You've actually named them. How, human. But I'm afraid your sentimental attachment is irrelevant. Those creatures are my property, and I have buyers waiting. Buyers? Jake's hand moved to his sidearm. You mean you came back to sell them after leaving them to die? Business is business, my crude friend. Death increases rarity, and rarity increases value. 2 perfectly preserved dragon specimens will fetch triple what they would have alive. I do hope you haven't damaged them. Jake looked down at Spark and Ember, who were listening to every word. He could see the fear in their golden eyes, the way they pressed closer to him for protection. These weren't specimens or property. They were his boys. Here's a counteroffer, Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that made smart people back away slowly. You get back in your fancy ship, fly away, and pretend you never saw us. In exchange, I don't turn you into a crater that'll be visible from orbit. Threats, really? Vexstar sounded amused. From someone flying a ship that appears to be held together with adhesive tape and wishful thinking. I think not. Through his viewport, Jake could see Vexstar's mercenaries spreading out, taking positions around the Lucky Strike. Professional movements, military precision. These weren't the usual hired thugs. Someone had paid premium rates for quality muscle. I'm going to give you one last chance to be reasonable, Vexstar continued. Surrender my property, and I'll even pay you a finder's fee. Refuse, and my associates will take them by force. I assure you, the second option will be far less pleasant for everyone involved. Jake looked at his options. His ship was surrounded, outgunned, and probably outnumbered 3-1. The smart play would be to negotiate, maybe try to buy the Cubs freedom. The professional play would be to cut his losses and walk away. Instead, Jake Murphy decided to do what he'd always done when faced with impossible odds and morally bankrupt opposition. He chose violence. You know what, Vexstar? Jake said into the comm. I've got a counter offer for you. Oh, do enlighten me. Go to hell. Jake cut the transmission, and immediately began powering up his ship's defensive systems. They weren't much, mostly jury-rigged shield generators, and a single plasma cannon that had seen better decades. But they'd have to do. Spark, Ember, he said, kneeling down to their level. Remember what we practiced. If things go bad, you hide in the shielded compartment until I come get you. Okay? Spark made a defiant chirping sound and breathed out a small puff of flame. Ember moved protectively in front of his smaller companion, scales darkening with what looked like anger. I know you want to help, Jake said gently, but this is my job. Taking care of you two is the most important thing I've ever done, and I'm not about to let some four-armed fashion disaster ruin it. Outside, Vexstar's voice boomed across the desert through external speakers. Such a shame, the alien announced theatrically. I had hoped we could resolve this like civilized beings. But if you insist on being difficult, so be it. Gentlemen, please retrieve my property. Try not to damage the specimens, but feel free to be creative with the human. The mercenaries began their advance, weapons powered and ready. Jake watched them through his targeting system, counting at least 8 heavily armed professionals, moving with tactical precision. Well boys, Jake said, settling into his gunner's position. Looks like we're about to find out what happens when human stubbornness meets alien arrogance. He powered up the plasma cannon, and selected his first target. Spoiler alert, it's probably going to be loud. The first shot came from Vexstar's mercenaries, a brilliant blue pulse that splashed harmlessly against the Lucky Strike's shields. Jake's return fire was more effective, his plasma bolt catching one of the advancing soldier's center mass and sending him tumbling across the sand in a shower of sparks from his ruined armor. 7 to go, Jake muttered, swiveling the cannon toward his next target. Come on, you beautiful piece of junk, don't fail me now. The Lucky Strike's shields flared as more weapons fire impacted them. Warning lights began flashing as the generator struggled to maintain power. Jake's ship might be tough, but it wasn't built for sustained combat against military-grade weapons. Shields at 60% and dropping, Jake announced to his passengers. Time to get creative. That's when Spark decided he'd had enough of hiding. The small dragon emerged from behind the console where Jake had told him to take cover, his copper-gold scales now glowing with an inner fire that Jake had never seen before. The cub's eyes burned with something that went beyond simple anger. This was the rage of a child who'd been abandoned, abused, and was now watching the only person who'd ever cared about him come under attack. Spark, no, Jake called out. Get back to the safe compartment. But Spark was done being afraid. He climbed onto the ship's main console and pressed his tiny claws against the viewport, staring out at the mercenaries advancing on their home. When he opened his mouth, what emerged wasn't the cute puff of smoke Jake had grown accustomed to. It was a concentrated stream of plasma fire that could have melted titanium. The beam lanced through the viewport, which should have been impossible since the transparent aluminum was rated for asteroid impacts. It struck the lead mercenary's weapon, superheating the metal instantaneously and turning the high-tech rifle into an expensive paperweight that welded itself to his armor. Holy crap, Jake breathed, staring at his tiny companion. Kid, where the hell did that come from? Ember, not to be outdone by his smaller companion, had discovered his own abilities. The obsidian-scaled cub's body began to shimmer, and suddenly there were 3 of him. Then 5. Then a dozen identical dragon cubs, all moving with perfect coordination around the ship's interior. Holographic projection, Jake realized. You're creating illusions. The real Ember chirped once, then all of his duplicates began moving toward different parts of the ship. Within seconds, the Lucky Strike's sensors were showing multiple dragon signatures throughout the vessel, making it impossible for anyone scanning from outside to determine where the real cubs were located. You two have been holding out on me, Jake said with a grin that was equal parts pride and combat adrenaline. But I like the initiative. Another volley of weapons fire hammered the shields, and Jake's console began screaming warnings about imminent system failure. Time for Plan B, which in Jake's experience usually involved explosives and questionable decision-making. Okay, new plan, he announced, pulling up his ship's cargo manifest. I've got about 50 kilos of mining charges in the cargo bay. Spark, think you can heat them up without blowing us to pieces? Spark chirped enthusiastically, his scales still glowing with contained fire. And Ember, I need you to make it look like we're running away. Can your illusions extend outside the ship? The obsidian cub tilted his head thoughtfully, then suddenly Jake's external cameras showed his ship lifting off. Except he could feel through his boots that they were still firmly on the ground. Beautiful, Jake said, arming the mining charges. Now comes the fun part. Through his real sensors, not the ones fooled by Ember's illusions, Jake watched Vexstar's mercenaries advance on what they thought was an abandoned ship. The alien entrepreneur himself was hanging back, naturally, letting his hired guns do the dangerous work while he supervised from a safe distance. Jake waited until the mercenaries were clustered around his ship's landing ramp, trying to breach the sealed entrance. Then he opened the cargo bay doors. 50 kilos of mining charges, heated to the point of instability by dragon fire, tumbled out onto the desert sand. The mercenaries had exactly enough time to look confused before Jake triggered the detonation. The explosion was visible from orbit. When the smoke cleared, Jake's ship was sitting in the middle of a perfectly circular crater, protected by its shields, but surrounded by the smoking remains of very expensive military equipment. The mercenaries themselves were scattered across the landscape, their armor's safety systems having activated to prevent lethal damage, but leaving them unconscious and very much out of the fight. And that, Jake said with satisfaction, is why you don't mess with a salvage operator's family. Vextar's voice crackled over the comm, no longer smooth and condescending. Now it carried the shrill edge of someone whose perfectly planned operation had just gone spectacularly wrong. You primitive barbarian. Do you have any idea how much those soldiers cost me? That equipment was worth more than your entire pathetic existence. Yeah, Jake replied, powering up his plasma cannon for another shot. Send me a bill. But Vextar wasn't finished. His ship's weapons came online, far more powerful than anything his mercenaries had been carrying. Military-grade particle cannons that could crack the Lucky Strike open like an egg. If I can't have my property intact, Vextar snarled, then I'll settle for revenge. Say goodbye to your little pets, human. The particle cannon fired, a lance of coherent energy that should have vaporized Jake's ship instantly. Instead, it struck what looked like a shimmering barrier of superheated air and dissipated harmlessly. Spark stood on the Lucky Strike's hull, no longer the tiny frightened cub Jake had rescued. He'd grown during the fight, not physically but in presence, in power. His scales blazed like molten metal, and the air around him rippled with heat distortion. The little dragon had discovered what he really was, not defective merchandise, but a creature of such raw power that it took love and trust to unlock it. Ember materialized beside his companion, his illusions now encompassing their entire surroundings. Vextar's targeting systems couldn't lock onto anything real, every sensor reading showing false positives and phantom signatures. Impossible, Vextar whispered over the comm. They're just cubs, defective cubs. That's where you're wrong, Jake said, climbing out of his ship to stand beside his boys. They're not defective, they just needed someone who believed in them. Spark looked up at Jake and made a sound that was half roar, half purr. Then he turned toward Vextar's ship and opened his mouth. What emerged wasn't fire, it was plasma, pure and focused, hot enough to cut through a ship's hull like paper. The beam struck Vextar's vessel just below the cockpit, slicing through the structural supports, and sending the entire front section tumbling to the sand. Vextar's ship crashed in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, its elegant lines now a testament to what happened when alien arrogance met human determination and dragon fire. Emergency beacon activated, came Vextar's panicked voice from the wreckage. Mayday, Mayday, this is the Exotic Emporium, requesting immediate assistance. I'm being attacked by a family, Jake finished for him. Something you wouldn't understand. As Vextar's distress signal echoed across the desert, Jake looked down at Spark and Ember, who were now back to their normal size but still glowing with residual power. Well boys, he said with a grin. I think it's time we found ourselves a new salvage site, somewhere a little more peaceful. Spark chirped agreement, then belched a small flame that formed the shape of a heart in the air. Yeah, Jake said, his voice going soft with pride. I love you guys too. 3 hours later, Jake was sitting on a crate of salvage components, watching Spark and Ember play what appeared to be a game of tag among the wreckage of Vextar's ship. The Cubs had figured out that Ember's illusions could create false targets for Spark's precision fire, turning combat training into entertainment. Jake made a mental note to find them a less explosive hobby when they got back to civilized space. You know, he said to the desert air, a habit that was probably permanent by now. When I woke up this morning, I was a simple salvage operator with simple problems. Now I'm apparently the galaxy's first human dragon dad with a ship full of military-grade scrap and a story nobody's going to believe. Vextar emerged from his crashed ship's emergency hatch, his once pristine robes now torn and stained with hydraulic fluid. His forearms moved in what Jake assumed were either surrender gestures or extremely rude alien curse words. Possibly both. This is preposterous, Vextar declared, though his voice had lost most of its earlier arrogance. I am a respected businessman. I have rights, I have lawyers. You had lawyers, Jake corrected, using his multi-tool to extract a particularly valuable-looking component from the wreckage. Now you're a guy who abandoned kids in the desert and then tried to murder the person who saved them. I'm pretty sure that violates several galactic statutes, not to mention basic decency. Spark bounded over and deposited a piece of twisted metal at Jake's feet, tail wagging like an oversized puppy. The metal was still glowing from dragon fire, shaped into what looked remarkably like a small sculpture of their ship. That's beautiful, buddy, Jake said, picking up the artwork carefully with heat-resistant gloves. We'll put it on the dashboard. Ember appeared beside them, no longer using his illusions now that the danger had passed. He carried a datapad that had somehow survived the crash, and his expression suggested he'd found something interesting. Jake took the pad and scrolled through the contents, his eyebrows climbing steadily higher. Well, he said. Looks like our friend Vextar has been very busy. Client lists, transaction records, shipping manifests for exotic creatures from across the galaxy. He looked up at the alien with disgust. You're not just a trader, are you? You're running an entire network. Vextar's expression went from indignant to panicked. Those records are confidential business documents. You have no right to. No right. Jake's voice carried the kind of cold fury that had made enemy soldiers reconsider their life choices. How many kids like Spark and Ember have you dumped on backwater planets? How many families have you torn apart for profit? The alien's silence was answer enough. Jake copied the data to his own systems and sent a burst transmission to the Galactic Authority. Within minutes, his comm was buzzing with responses from law enforcement agencies across 3 sectors. Apparently, Vextar's exotic emporium had been on several wanted lists for quite some time. Congratulations, Jake told the dejected alien. You're about to become very popular with some very unpleasant people. I hear Krylon Maximum Security Prison has lovely accommodations this time of year. A new ship appeared on the horizon, official markings identifying it as Galactic Authority Enforcement. Jake wasn't surprised, his little fireworks display had probably been visible from the next star system, and exploding exotic animal dealers tended to attract official attention. Jake Murphy, the voice over the comm was crisp and professional. This is Captain Reese of the GA enforcement vessel Vigilant. We received your data packet regarding suspected trafficking violations. Permission to come aboard. Permission granted, Jake replied. Fair warning though, I've got 2 dragon cubs with me, and they're a little protective after recent events. Understood. We'll approach slowly. 20 minutes later, Captain Reese stood in Jake's cargo bay, a middle-aged woman with the kind of steady competence that made Jake remember why he'd liked some of his former officers. She watched with apparent fascination as Spark demonstrated his fire-breathing abilities, while Ember created holographic butterflies for his companion to chase. Remarkable, she said. We've been tracking the Vextar case for 2 years, but we could never get enough evidence to make charges stick. These cubs are the missing piece we needed. They're not evidence, Jake said firmly. They're my crew. Captain Reese smiled. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. In fact, given what we found in Vextar's records, these 2 are probably safer with you than anywhere else. His operation had clients in some very unsavory corners of the galaxy. She handed Jake an official-looking datapad. Adoption papers, if you're interested. The authority has emergency provisions for situations like this. All it needs is your signature and theirs. Jake looked down at Spark and Ember, who had stopped playing to listen to the conversation. They might not understand all the words, but they clearly understood the stakes. What do you say, boys? Jake asked. Want to make this official? Spark chirped enthusiastically, and breathed a small heart-shaped flame. Ember pressed his claws against the datapad in what was unmistakably an attempt at a signature. I'll take that as a yes, Jake said, adding his own signature with hands that weren't quite steady. Captain Reese witnessed the document and uploaded it to the authorities' databases. Congratulations, Jake Murphy. You're now the legal guardian of 2 very special young dragons. Guardian, crew chief, whatever, Jake said, trying to sound casual despite the fact that his heart felt like it might explode from happiness. We've got salvage to find and adventures to have. As the authority ship departed with Vextar in custody, Jake began the process of getting the Lucky Strike ready for takeoff. The hull had taken some damage during the fight, but nothing that couldn't be patched with salvaged materials from their defeated enemy ship. So he said to his new family as they settled into the cockpit, where should we go next? I hear the Kepler Nebula has some interesting derelicts, and the frontier territories are always good for finding forgotten treasures. Spark pointed at the star charts with one small claw, selecting a system at random. Ember nodded approvingly, then created an illusion of their ship flying among the stars. The Altair system it is, Jake said, laying in the course. Fair warning though, it's a long trip. Hope you boys don't get space sick. As the Lucky Strike lifted off from Keth 9's surface, leaving behind a crater that would puzzle xenoarchaeologists for decades, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. He'd gone from a lonely scavenger talking to himself in the void to the head of the galaxy's most unusual salvage crew. You know what the best part is? He said to Spark and Ember as they jumped to hyperspace. Every other salvage operator in the galaxy is going to be so jealous when they hear about this. I've got the only ship in known space with dragon-powered excavation capabilities. Spark belched a small flame that somehow managed to look smug. Plus, Jake continued, if anyone gives us trouble, we can always fall back on the time-honored tradition of setting them on fire and making them disappear. Ember created an illusion of himself wearing a tiny pirate hat, which made Spark laugh in a way that sounded like wind chimes made of joy. Yeah, Jake said, settling back in his pilot's chair as his ship carried his family toward whatever adventures waited among the stars. I think we're going to do just fine. Behind them, Keth 9 grew smaller in the viewport, just another backwater planet in an indifferent galaxy. But for three beings who'd found each other in the vast emptiness of space, it would always be the place where a family was born from the simple act of one person refusing to walk away from those who needed help. And in a universe full of Vextars and their casual cruelties, that was the most human thing of all. The Lucky Strike disappeared into hyperspace, carrying its crew toward a future full of salvage, adventure, and the kind of bonds that no amount of money could buy or break. Somewhere in the galaxy, exotic animal dealers were about to have a very bad time. Jake Murphy wouldn't have it any other way.